Welcome to episode 29 of 10 Seconds to Survive Loss of Control in Flight. This is an extraordinary event that did not receive the attention it deserved, likely because the crew ultimately solved the problem, recovered the aircraft, and brought everyone home safely. Let's set the stage. An Airbus A340 at high altitude cruise over the Swiss Alps. A sudden mountain wave encounter, a severe overspeed, then the threat reverses towards stall. This is a real-world event. On board, 259 souls. What followed was not a simple aircraft handling problem. It was a fast-moving human factors challenge shaped by startle, unexpected system behavior, spatial disorientation, escalating warnings, shrinking margins, and stress so intense it later included memory gaps consistent with retrograde amnesia. In this full presentation, Captain Brad Bennetts takes you through the event step by step, how it developed, why it became so complex, and what helped the crew recover. Brad is the former leader of the South African Airways UPRT program and a recognized expert in Airbus fly-by-wire operations and advanced upset training. In moments like this, pilots do not need a menu of disconnected techniques. They need a response they can access immediately and apply under pressure. That is the operational value of a unified recovery strategy. In this case, the long-standing, relentlessly field-tested and proven APS all-attitude upset recovery strategy. Here is Captain Brad Bennetts. Enjoy.
Hello everyone and greetings from South Africa. My thanks to the organizers of this event for the opportunity and honor of talking to you all today about a severe overspeed and stall event that occurred a few years ago over the Swiss Alps. To cut straight to the chase, the analysis and final report produced 6 distinct phases in the event sequence, which I'll now summarize as follows. Phase 1 was the normal flight prior to the perturbation. The aircraft, an Airbus 340-600, was at a normal high-altitude cruise level, routing to Frankfurt overhead the Swiss Alps after nearly 10 hours of flight time. The flight deck crew had just finished their rotation, were prior to descent, and were preparing for the approach. The captain was the pilot flying, and it was his first solo flight on the Airbus after spending many years on Boeing aircraft as a domestic captain. Phase 2 is the upset and the overspeed that occurred. So a few minutes prior to descent, the aircraft was subjected to a rapid wind gradient, which was consistent with forecast mountain wave activity. Over a period of 14 seconds, there was a decrease of 41 knots in the tailwind which they were experiencing, and that resulted in a severe overspeed. The MMO of 0.86 was exceeded by Mach 0.03. At the peak of the overspeed, the trend vector was 30 knots above the indicated speed value, and the top of the trend vector at approximately Mach 0.937. Due to the fact that the speed trend vector was predicting a speed beyond MD, or max design speed, the overspeed was classed as severe. The combination of the rapid speed at which the overspeed occurred and the severe predictive trend meant that this overspeed contributed to crew startle and obviously the anticipation of significant potential harm. This overspeed also presented in a way that the simulators at South African Airways had not been able to recreate. It was, even for experienced crew, something they had never seen before of similar intensity. The overspeed warning became active and contributed to the surprise and startle effect of the crew, who had been at that stage in a relatively low workload environment. During the overspeed, the crew disconnected the autopilot. They received their fair share of criticism over this action, as the Airbus recommendation was to keep the autopilot engaged. However, there was a difference between what the flight crew expected of the automation and the system's actual behavior. Aspects that contributed to this difference in expectation included the SAA simulator standard. The Flight Control Primary Computer, or FCPC standard, of the 340-600 simulator was not the same as the FCPC standard that was installed in the aircraft. This meant that the simulator's automatic system behavior was different to the real aircraft. Now, during a severe overspeed, the crew's expectation was that the autopilot would disconnect and the high-speed protection would pitch the aircraft nose up. The FCOM describes the autopilot disconnect speed as Mach 0.89. However, when the aircraft reached Mach 0.892 and appeared to be accelerating towards maximum structural speed, the autopilot did not disconnect and the aircraft did not pitch up. The contributing factors that influenced the crew's decision to manually pitch the aircraft's nose up included the speed at which the situation developed, the trend prediction in the overspeed, the altitude loss due to the downdraft component of a mountain wave, the behavior of the automatic protection systems being different to what they were expecting, also the effect of surprise and stress on the crew to revert to simple, rule-based and intuitive actions to correct the overspeed. There was spatial disorientation that was caused by the illusion of an aircraft nose-down pitch, which we'll discuss a bit later. Evidence collected in the crew interviews and the FDR data, as well as the recreation of the event in the simulator, indicated that there were significant surprise and stress effects on the crew, which I'm sure you can understand. One of the crew actually described the fear sensation as having penetrated the deepest part of his body. Now we know that surprise and severe stress often cause crew to revert to simple, rule-based intuitive responses to deal with threats. The action of raising the aircraft nose to reduce the speed forms part of the foundational pilot knowledge on the primary and secondary effects of controls and is a normal practice to teach the skill at the beginning of pilot training. This creates what is referred to as primacy, which makes it very likely for a pilot to use when being subjected to stressful conditions. There was a lot of spatial disorientation. In oversimplistic terms, the aircraft entered a wall of air, i.e. the mountain wave. Upon entering this wave, the airspeed reading, which obviously uses dynamic air pressure, increased to show an overspeed. What was misleading about this representation of the speed is that it implied that the aircraft was accelerating, which was temporarily true from the airspeed perspective, but not from a longitudinal acceleration perspective. The flight data recorder data confirmed that the mountain wave caused longitudinal deceleration. So this presented conflicting sensory signals to the flight crew. What they saw visually was an apparent rapid increase in speed, and this conflicted with their vestibular sensation of slowing down. Now, the force that is applied to the pilot's vestibular system in the ears is known as gravito-inertial force. Using data from the flight data recorder, our human factors expert calculated and plotted the perceived pitch, which is shown in the red line on the graph, together with the actual pitch of the aircraft shown as a green line, and the captain's side stick position, which is shown as a black line on the graph. The analysis produced results that were actually quite significant. Before the overspeed, the perceived pitch in red and the actual pitch in green had less than 0.5 degrees difference. This small difference was due to the weakening of gravity at higher altitudes. In simple terms, the crew's perception of pitch and the aircraft's actual pitch were the same in stable flight. However, from the start of the mountain wave encounter to the start of the overspeed warning, the perceived pitch in red was decreasing and diverging to nose down, whilst the actual pitch of the aircraft in green was moving slightly nose up. This was due to the autopilot compensating for the altitude loss in the downdraft. When the divergence reached a maximum difference, the crew disengaged the autopilot and pulled the stick off to around 67% of maximum travel. So in simple terms, due to an illusion, the crew felt the nose was pitching down, and combined with the effect of surprise and startle, instinctively corrected this imbalance. The aircraft pitch, which is shown in green, increased to around 11 degrees following the side stick aft input. After the incident, the crew believed that the aircraft had actually automatically disengaged the autopilot and pitched the nose up. It was more than a month after the incident, and after analyzing the flight data recorder data, that the crew became aware that the pitch up had actually been performed manually. This is classed as a type 1 disorientation. In comes phase 3, the next hole in the Swiss cheese model. This was in the form of the Airbus Operating Engineering Bulletin, or OEB 49. Now, OEB 49 was a red OEB. This indicated that it may have significant impact on the safety of the aircraft. OEB 49 was issued in response to an undue activation of the alpha protection system, or the aerodynamic stall protection system, which occurred on an A321 in 2014. The Airbus 321 lost 4,000 feet of altitude due to the alpha protection system erroneously reducing the angle of attack by pitching the nose down. The incident's probable cause included aspects relating to a damaged angle of attack vanes and ice formation. So this was published in the QRH and the FCOM, and the crew were required to read and review this OEB on every sector. The crew at that stage misinterpreted the scenario that was unfolding before them as the preconditions of the application of this OEB, and in so doing switched off ADRs 2 and 3. In doing so, the flight control law became alternate law, and the order thrust failed, which was as designed to do. Due to the overspeed, the order thrust had commanded idle thrust, so that when the ADRs 2 and 3 were turned off, the engine thrust locked at idle thrust. So it's important to understand from the crew's perspective. This moment is 9 seconds into a startling and high-risk event. In other words, the crew had 9 seconds under extreme duress and startle to process everything that we have discussed up to this point. The application of OEB 49 caused a cascade of warnings and cautions and had a profound effect on the startle and the stress effects at this critical moment. When combined with all the other complex factors that we've described up to now, it resulted in the aircraft climbing rapidly at high altitude with little automatic system protection, and the safety of the flight almost completely resting on the captain, who at that stage was the only one with working displays. At this moment in the sequence, the startle and the stress effect increased significantly. In phase 4 of the event, which incorporated the speed decay and the cruise stress, we look at the next 24 seconds. The airspeed reduced to its lowest recorded value of 198 knots, and the thrust was sitting at around 36%. The captain stated that he had felt an extreme high level of stress during this period. He has large gaps in his memory as well. He does remember trying to concentrate on maintaining a constant and safe pitch attitude with wings level. At this point, the third pilot heard the oral stall warning of stall, stall, and noticed that the thrust and the speed was low and was decreasing. From the onset of the overspeed warning to the application of OEB 49 was 19 seconds. From the application of OEB 49 to the first stall warning was 25 seconds. In those 25 seconds, there was an information and warning overload. There was an altitude alert, a thrust lock chime, there were 3 VHF transmissions from ATC, the cockpit door buzzer sounded a few times from the cabin crew, and 25 seconds of master caution. So from a visual perspective, the co-pilot's screens had red warnings and no data. The captain's PFD had amber crosses from the alternate law indications, and the flight director would have been providing conflicting guidance. The master caution and the ECAM were producing caution lights and amber lights, and the FMA was flashing thrust lock in amber. So from a handling perspective, the captain was flying the aircraft manually, in alternate law, at high altitude for the first time ever, which due to maneuvering stability would have made manual flight handling of the aircraft very challenging. Interviews with the crew indicated gaps in their memory during this period, and we know that retrograde amnesia can be associated with periods of extremely high stress levels. Research has shown that this could be for up to 30 seconds. The captain, for example, only recalls trying to maintain wings level and a constant safe pitch attitude while feeling like he was in a state of shock. The last aspect that probably contributed to the crew's acute stress was the disruption of preconditioned expectancy. So pilots develop expectations of high reliability from their normal daily operations. The perceived failure of the system to adequately handle the event, and the apparent malfunctions that occurred disrupted the crew's conditioned expectancy, which may have significantly added to their stress levels. At this point, as the airspeed decayed to the alpha stall warning, there was a breakdown in active scanning and monitoring of the speed scale. Each pilot was facing a different perspective and role, as we have said before, and a tremendous amount of information overload through the effects of high stress. Let's now look at phase 5 of the event, which is the approach to stall recovery. The conclusion at this stage was that the aircraft was in the approach to stall. The aircraft was at an altitude of 39,900 feet, and the grid mora over that area of the Swiss Alps was 16,600 feet. In simple terms, the aircraft was about to run out of lift. The single most important and critical act that the crew performed to avert catastrophe was the upset recovery maneuver. This brought the aircraft from a state of an approach to stall and loss of control into aerodynamic stability with control. As discussed previously, the crew had high stress levels, confusion about aircraft system state, but instead of an ineffective, incomplete or absent stall recovery, they had been properly trained to apply the APS all-attitude upset recovery strategy. The captain recalled hearing the oral stall warning as well as the feeling and aerodynamic buffet, and he responded by applying the recovery strategy. The co-pilot remembers thinking, "We're in big trouble. We had to get this aeroplane flying." He too was brought into the loop with the shouting of the upset recovery strategy. There were 3 cabin crew who reported feeling a rattle go through the aircraft like they'd never felt before. The captain, immediately after verbalizing the strategy, pushed the side stick forward to achieve a nose-low pitch of -6 degrees. During the initial moments of the recovery maneuver, the captain made 4 successive push and pull movements on the side stick. The stall warning activated 4 times, and the maximum recorded angle of attack value was 8.1 degrees. The investigation team and the Airbus's accident investigation representatives were in agreement that the conditions of high altitude, alternate law, low energy, this all provided a sluggish aircraft response to pitch commands, and that the oscillations were related to the unfamiliar circumstances for the pilot flying. The captain also took hold of the thrust levers during the power step of the strategy and started to manually advance the thrust, which at that stage had been locked at idle since the failure of the order thrust. The altitude dropped from 39,700 feet to 35,000 feet during the recovery, with the vertical speed ranging from -2,000 feet per minute to -6,200 feet per minute. Phase 6 of the event is the system's recovery to normal flight. So with the overspeed and the approach to stall resolved, the crew turned to dealing with the landing in Frankfurt, and once the aiders were re-engaged, the aircraft's flight control primary computers returned to normal law. The autopilots were re-engaged, and a safe landing was carried out in Frankfurt. So in summary, the stall warning and the APS upset prevention and recovery strategy provided the training for the cues, the goals, the actions, and the expectations that extracted the crew from this high stress and low situational awareness into attending critical priorities. The human factors expert referred to this type of action as recognized prime decision. The situation is assessed by understanding the goals that fit, increasing the importance of relevant cues, forming expectations by using mental models, and identifying typical actions required, all a function of the APS or latitude upset recovery strategy. I hope that by the end of the summit, everyone here will realize the importance of effective UPRT program training, the importance of having a properly trained instructor to deliver the program. Thank you for your time.